Hi, this is Jack for iPokerVIP.net. This is the first part of a 5-part concept video series focusing on what I think are the biggest leaks of break-even or marginally winning players at small stakes. Leaks I'm trying to fix in these videos comes from mistakes I see marginal winners make in my games, and mistakes I've found from seeing people's posts on the 2+2 forums and in Skype study groups. The first part is going to be trying to help you really focus on position, which is definitely something that marginal winners do not do enough. They play far too many hands out of position and nowhere near enough hands when they're in position. This is almost going to be an introduction to the other videos, which are all going to expand on the power that positions brings you and why it's so important in poker. Part 2 will be about floating and how to combat people who float you, which is again something that marginal winners just don't pay enough attention to. They're happy folding to too many c-bets, they're c-betting too much and not too barreling the turn enough. And it's something that we're going to address in part 2 because it's going to be costing you a lot of money if you're doing that yourself. When we move on to part 3, we're going to talk about 3-betting our 4-betting strategy, showing you the maths to make sure you aren't 4-betting the wrong hands for value, and talking about theory as to why certain hands are better to 3-bet than others. Part 4 is going to be talking about hands which you should be calling 3-bets with, and how to play post-flop in 3-bet pots when you don't have the initiative. That's something that I don't think there's any content online on articles or videos from what I've seen, so that should be really useful to you and give you some really good ideas about what you can take to the tables to increase your win rate when facing a 3-bet. Part 5 is going to tie all of these concept videos together by discussing how we should be playing blind versus blind, which is a massive leak for a lot of small stakes players who have completely the wrong strategy. They don't think about blind versus blind play enough. It requires quite a lot of brain power because it's not like standard 6-max situations. Each player's range is both really wide, so that's going to be a very interesting video. Moving on to this presentation about position. First we're going to need to talk about why it's so important, and then we're going to see how it works in practice. So first we'll do a bit of theory, and then we'll have some hand history examples to really show this concept in practice. Obviously you might have read books or seen videos, so you know that position matters a lot in poker, but understanding why is what's critical. It's not good enough in poker to just know that something's good or bad. You have to know why, and when you do understand why, then it's going to really help you improve as a player. So essentially when we have position, our opponent has to act before us on every street. Now since we have more information before acting, we're going to make less mistakes. Whether that mistake is missing out on a value bet, or whether that mistake is missing out on a good spot to bluff, we're going to make way more of those mistakes out of position than when we're in position, because when we're in position our opponent acts first and we're going to get a good idea of whether the card that came helped him or not. In poker obviously the more mistakes we make, the more money we lose, and the fewer mistakes we make, the more money we win. That should go without saying. So therefore, being in position, we're going to make less mistakes, we're going to make more money. In addition, 3 out of the 4 betting rounds occur post-flop, and the pot size increases exponentially in poker. So a small pot pre-flop can be a very large pot by the river if all 3 streets post-flop get bet. Additionally, there's going to be a lot of turn and river cards which change the texture of the board and change the strength of both his range and our range, and therefore there's going to be a lot of situations where a strong hand on the flop isn't necessarily a strong hand on the river, and our opponent's going to end up, he's not going to be sure whether to value bet or whether to bluff because he's out of position. He doesn't know whether the card helped us or not because he hasn't seen us act, he hasn't seen us react to the card yet. So position when the pot gets big is very, very important, and being in position is going to help us make less mistakes than he will. Additionally, very often when our opponent raises with a wide range pre-flop, he's going to want a pot control or keep the pot small at some stage on the turn or the river. This isn't so true when he raises from under the gun, although he's still going to have some marginal hands. For example, when he's got like pocket 10s and the board comes king high, he's not really going to want to bet 3 times. He's going to have to check a street and make it quite obvious that he hasn't got a very strong hand. And that's something that we can really exploit when we're in position that we can't necessarily exploit as well out of position. And the reason why is that it's relatively easy for him, being in position, to just check back a street, check back the turn and keep the pot small, or bet the turn and then check back the river to be guaranteed to see a showdown. Even if he wants to check back the turn and you want to bluff the river, it's going to be much easier for him to call when he's in position because the pot's so much smaller and you only have one opportunity to bet and get him off his hand. However, out of position, he can only check and hope that that his opponent doesn't bet. So if you're in position on him, he can only check and hope that you don't bet. If he checks the turn, you can bet twice when you're in position, so he isn't removing a betting round. Whilst if he checks the river out of position, he can't see a showdown, as you can still fire a big bet. By playing in position, you will find lots of occasions where you have a good idea of your opponent's range and he knows relatively little about yours, because obviously he hasn't seen you react to the turn or the river card if it's changed the texture of the board. This means you can bluff or value bet much more effectively when you're in position than when you're out of it, because you know more about his range than he does about yours. Additionally, you know that when your opponent's multi-barreling, he's going to be much more polarized, and therefore you can potentially make easier hero folds or hero calls on the later street, because of course if a turn or river card changes the board, he's generally got to be at least a little bit cautious that you've hit that card, and he's not going to value bet really thin. You know, he's going to have like those mid pair and top pair weak kicker hands that have to check and try and get the showdown cheaply. Moving on to the next slide, we can see that from the basic numbers, we can see how pot sizes change from the flop to the river. If you raise pre-flop and get a caller, and it's heads up to the flop, you make a c-bet and that gets called. Typically on the turn, the pot's going to be 14 to 17 big blinds in size. Turn bet's going to be 10 to 14 big blinds, and going into the river, if called, the pot's going to be 34 to 45. So any bet on the river is going to be pretty big as well. When you've got wide ranges, or when your opponent's got a wide range at least, there's going to be so many times where he doesn't want to put in a lot of money. He's going to get to the turn and he's not going to want to put in another 2 bets. You know, he's not going to want to put in like 30 big blinds plus with some of his mid pair or his top pair weak kicker hands. And that's something that you can really exploit when you're in position, because you can force the action, whereas out of position you can't. Person in position has, like we said, a huge advantage because he can ultimately control whether a bet goes in or whether the pot stays small. Your opponent can't just always take marginal hands and pot control them, because if he checks you can just bet anyway, which was the whole point of checking in the first place, since the whole point of him checking is to try and keep the pot small. If his choice is bet himself or check and have you bet for him, then there's no good options available to him in lots of spots where he's got a marginal hand. This is especially true like where he raises the cutoff with a hand like, I don't know, 10-8 suited, and he flops a 10. He's not really looking to put in a lot of money there. He's not really looking to bet all 3 streets. But because he's out of position, if you call on the button, he doesn't have a choice. If you want to force the action and put money in for him, then he's going to have to make a really tough decision whether he calls you down or whether he folds. And when people have tough decisions to make, that's when they make mistakes, because obviously their brain's being put to the test almost. They've got to make a decision, and there's a chance that they're going to make the wrong one. So that concludes the PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to move on to some hand history examples which really demonstrate how tough it can be playing out of position with a wide range, or at least how difficult it can be playing out of position with when you have a marginal strength hand. So I'll just pull up Holder Manager and get a couple of hand histories for you. So the first hand we're going to look at is this one with pocket jacks, and we open in middle position and get called by the cutoff, who seems to be a fairly taggy regular player playing 24-19, and the rest of the table folds. We see the flop of 8-7-3. We go ahead and bet, obviously for value, and we get called. And now when he calls here, he's obviously going to have a lot of hands like 8-9 suited, 10-8 suited, pocket 9s, pocket 10s, maybe some stuff like 6s and 5s, maybe like 7-6 suited, some flush draws, some straight draws. In general though, his range is going to be pretty weak. I'd expect him to raise if he had a really strong hand, because it's quite a wet board texture. He doesn't want a scary turn coming and for me to get, you know, scared with whatever hand I have. So he usually just raises 2 pair of his sets on the flop. Turn comes a king, which doesn't help his range. It helps my perceived range, however it doesn't really help my exact hand. For example, I don't think I can bet the turn and bet the river and get called down by a worse hand. He might peel the turn with hands like pocket 9s, but he's going to usually fold on the river if I 3-barrel. With that said, I can't really check the turn, because if I had nothing, he'd expect me to fire again. If I had ace queen or ace jack, he'd just expect me to go ahead and bluff the turn, because like this is a card that I can obviously quite legitimately represent. So if I was to check here, he's going to put me on some kind of hand with showdown value. I don't think he's going to bluff very often, so if I was to check, I'd be in a bit of a tough spot when he does bet, because obviously it's quite hard for me to be beat, but at the same time I don't think he's going to bluff the turn when I check. So I decided to bet again, because I definitely think he can call again with like pocket nines, pocket tens, 8-9 suited, those type of hands. And I think that it works better for my overall game to bet this turn again, because obviously, like I said, I'll be betting this turn if I had air. So I'll go ahead and bet, and he calls. And on the river now I get a 7, and I don't think I can value that. Obviously, I think he's going to fold like 9s or 10s by the time we get to the river. If he did call twice with a hand like 9-10, he's just going to fold it because he's missed. If he's got 8-9, I think he's going to fold as well. And of course, there is some possibility I'm beat by like a flush draw that called twice, or king queen or ace king that floated the flop, or if he called twice with a hand like 6-7, then that now beats me as well. So I'll go ahead and check, and he fires a big bet. Now the problem is, whilst this might seem like an easy check fold, obviously, once I check the river, he knows that I don't ever have a really strong hand. So he knows that usually I'm either just giving up or I have some kind of weak showdown value that doesn't really want to put a lot of money in. So this would be a really great spot for him to turn a hand into a bluff like pocket nines or pocket tens, and he's just going to make me fold so much in my range when he bets here, because it just looks like I'm check folding. Also, if he's got a hand like 9-10, he's probably just going to bluff with it, or if he floated the flop with clubs and then called when he picked up a flush draw, he's probably just going to bluff that as well. Essentially though, it's a spot where I can't really hero call, because I don't know if he's capable of having that many bluffs in his range. But basically this just shows you the power of position, because I have no idea what he's got, but he has a pretty good idea of what I've got when I check the river at least, and he can play quite well against that. At best he's probably putting me on a hand like king jack, but even that's not exactly thrilled to check call a big river bet. So it's a spot where I obviously have to fold my hand. But I think that it goes quite a long way to demonstrate how difficult it can be playing out of position, because pocket jacks is a very good hand pre-flop, and it's a very good hand on the flop, and it's still a pretty good hand on the turn. But by the time we get to the river and he's called twice, it's not looking so hot with pocket jacks there, and I haven't got a hand that can call a big river bet. And obviously that's something that if I was in position there, and say I raised the button, he called from the big blind, I could bet the flop, I could bet the turn, and then just check back the river and be guaranteed to see a showdown. Whereas when I'm out of position and I go ahead and two barrel and then check the river, there's still the option of him firing this huge river bet, and I just have to fold. There's nothing else really that I can do about it. Let's look at another hand as well that demonstrates a similar point. I'll just bring that up now. So this is another hand where we're going to see how difficult it can be to play out of position. And it's a hand where I open queen jack offsuit under the gun, which isn't regularly, it's not a standard open, but we had a really huge fish in the big blind. He's playing like 50% of hands, so I wanted to try and isolate him. There's not many aggressive players behind me. I'm not expecting to get free bet very much in these spots, so I expect mostly it's just going to fold around, and he's going to call when I play a pot heads up in position versus him. As it is, I end up getting called by the regular in the calf, who's quite a loose regular, playing like 31-25. Flop comes queen 7-3, and this is a spot where I could go ahead and like check call the flop, but I think that makes the hand very difficult to play. I definitely think I can get value from worse hands by just betting here, so that's what I decide to go ahead and do. And he calls me, and the turn's a 9, and this is one of those tricky spots where I can't really, if I two barrel here, I think he just folds like pocket 4s, 5s, 6s, also like a weak like 7-8 or 6-7. I think he just folds that on the turn too. And so when he calls me, I think I'm pretty crushed versus his range, because he's going to have all the ace-queen combos, most of the king-queen combos. There's a chance he's obviously got like 9-7 suited or pocket 9s. But basically it's a spot where I don't really expect to get called by worse if I barrel again, but I'm obviously getting called by all better hands, and then I'm just bloating the pot against hands which beat me. So I decided to go ahead and check and essentially see what happens, which is a bad plan anyway, but it's the kind of like the best of two options really, because at least there's a chance that he's just going to check it down with a hand like pocket 10s or pocket 8s. So I check and he bets, and I think that I definitely have to check call once, because there's some floats in his range on the flop, like there's flush draws, or just generally like, I don't know, ace 10 of spades. I assume that he floats the flop with those types of hands as well, because he is quite a loose player. And so I'm definitely going to go ahead and check call once and just see what happens on the river, which isn't a great plan like I said, but it's kind of like the only option I have available to me. And now the river comes in, it's an 8, and if he was to, I'll check again, and if he was to fire a big river bet here, I mean I'm in a really tricky spot, because yeah, the flush draw missed, but my range is fairly face up when I check call the turn there. I mean, on this type of drawy board, I'm not going to check call the turn with a set or with like ace queen, so my range is pretty weak, and you know, it contains a lot of hands like the one I have, and he's going to be putting me on this type of hand, a pocket, you know, a queen jack or pocket jacks, pocket tens type hand. So if he fires a big bet on the river, then you know, yeah, he can be bluffing, but he can also be value betting really well, because he's clearly going to value bet king queen or better by the time he gets to the river. And there's also a few hands in his range, like if he bet pocket eights for protection on the turn, well, he's just river to set. If he had pocket nines, he's got a set as well. If he's got 7-8, then he's obviously made two pair and he now beats me. So there's a lot of hands in his range that beat me. There's also quite a few bluffs, and it's going to be a really tough spot if he was to bet big on the river. As for the results, he ended up checking and he had pocket tens. So I guess I got quite lucky. It would have been interesting to see what he did if he had like ace 10 of diamonds there, whether he would have fired a big bluff on the river or not. And I would have been in a tough spot, and I would have had to check fold, but I wouldn't have been really very happy about it. Okay, so I just wanted to look at a couple of hands where we called pre-flop and we make the use of our position. So we have a hand here where the cutoff opens. He's playing 30-21, so he's a bit of a sort of loose. He's pretty loose, but he has a, you know, an idea of what he's doing with regards to poker. And I call him a button with king 10 suited, and the flop comes jack 6-5, dry flop with we got a backdoor flush draw and an overcard and a backdoor straight draw. He c-bets, I'll go ahead and call. I think that when he bets half pot, he can definitely be doing this with a wide range of hands, and there's a good chance I'm going to be able to steal it on the turn or the river. And there's also a small chance I actually improve and, you know, make a decent hand. The turn comes a queen and he bets half pot again, and I'm getting a good price to call, because I think that if he does happen to have a hand and I manage to hit my 9 or I manage to hit a 9 or an ace, then there's some decent implied odds because it's quite well concealed. Certainly the ace is a really well concealed card, and if it gives him two pair, I think he's going to put in a lot of money. In addition, this is obviously a good two-barrel card for him in general, and he's going to be barreling this card light, and if I do call again, I think there's a good chance he's going to check fold the river if he doesn't have a hand. So it's like, if he doesn't have a hand and there is a blank, he's just going to check fold. If he does have a hand and there is a blank, he's going to bet and I have to fold, but I think that that's, you know, not all that likely really. And if I hit the river and he has a hand, I actually managed to make some money. So it's a spot where there's quite a few situations that I can see myself winning the pot on the river, which is why I go ahead and call again. And the river's a 5 and he checks, and now I have a really good spot where I don't think he's going to have a very big hand when he checks the river here. I don't think he should expect me to bet. Like most of the time when I call on the turn, it's going to be hand, like just because of my flop calling range, when I call on the turn again, it's usually going to be stuff like jack 10, king jack, those type of hands. So if he had a value hand or like a really strong hand, I think he'd go ahead and just bet it, because he shouldn't expect me to bet those hands when checked to, but I can definitely look him up. I can put him on like a miss flush draw or miss straight draw. So if he had a good hand, I think he'd just go ahead and bet it and expect to get a call a decent amount of the time. Similarly, when he checks, he shouldn't expect me to really bet like anything except a really nutted hand, like you know, like if I manage to get to the river with like 6-5 or queen jack, or if I floated the flop with ace queen, should probably expect me to bet that on the river. But in general, it's kind of the spot where it's really hard for me to be bluffing, and he should expect me to only be value betting when I bet this river. So I'll go ahead and bet 36, which you can see I'm giving myself a good price. Don't need to fold all that often, but even if he's got a hand as strong as like queen 10 in this spot, I think he has a really tough time calling. And certainly if he's got like ace jack or worse, then I definitely don't think he's going to call on this river, because it's really hard for me to be bluffing. It looks like I'm value betting, and I actually managed to get him to fold. So it's a spot where I make use of position quite well. I call on the flop, which is quite a standard float. We'll talk about that in part 2. Call on the turn just because I don't think from his bet size and that I don't think he's particularly strong, and if he is strong, then I've got good implied odds anyway when I actually manage to hit. But mainly I think I'll be able to steal it a lot on the river, which is exactly what happens when he checks. Obviously if he was to bet that river, I would just fold, and if I was out of position, I wouldn't really be able to win the pot, because if I was to check call twice out of position and then check the river, well then he'd just check back and see a showdown, you know, if he's got like a weak jack or something. So it's a type of spot where I made use of position. That was the only way I wouldn't have won this part if I was out of position, but I did win it when I was in position, and it was purely through the fact that, you know, once the turn and river card changes the board texture, a lot of hands that were strong on the flop, like Jack 10, or even like we said, like Ace Jack, they can't really put a lot of money in on both the turn and the river. They have to sort of bet the turn and then just check fold the river once I bet, because it's really hard for me to be bluffing. So here's another interesting hand where we call pre-flop in position and then make use of our position on later streets. Here the small blind opens, he's playing 26-21, so he's pretty loose regular, but he's definitely a good player, and I'll go ahead and call with king queen off. Flop comes 7-7-4, giving us backdoor flush draw and 2 overcards. He c-bets, and I go ahead and call. I think it's pretty standard call on the flop, and then we see a turn. Turns an 8 and he 2 barrels. That's a spot where most people would fold, but I think that he's obviously going to put me on a lot of floats when I call the flops. There's a chance that he's 2 barreling light. There's also a good chance that he's 2 barreling for sort of thin value / protection with an 8 or with a hand like pocket 9s or 10s. Whereas if he was in position, he might just check those hands back and see a river. But out of position, I think he's going to bet because he doesn't know what to do if he checks. So I think that once he bets the turn, he can have a lot of bluffs, and he can also have a lot of bluffs, and he can have a lot of hands that are like thin value / protection. Even a hand like 6s or 5s, he might bet on the turn because he doesn't want to check and be put in a tough spot. So I decided to go ahead and raise here, and I think that is a spot where I'm really credibly repping a 7 or like 7-8 or like 5-6, and it's not a spot where he's going to expect me to be bluffing. Now I wouldn't be making this raise if I was out of position, because I'd assume that his turn barreling range when he's in position is going to be a bit more polarized. I know that goes against what we said earlier, but I think that blind v blind is much more of a different spot than in regular situations, and we'll expand more on that in part 5 when we talk about blind v blind play. Like if he was under the gun and I was in the cutoff, wouldn't expect him to necessarily be barreling this turn very light, because it really would help my perceived range. However, blind v blind, because our ranges are so wide pre-flop, and then because our range is so wide on the flop, I think that's going to be barreling a lot more with like pocket 6s or just a random 8 for protection, or even like ace high for just trying to get me off of floats. So yeah, this is a spot where I think that we're repping like a really legit range when we actually make the raise, because people aren't really going to expect us to bluff raise in this spot. And if he does have a hand like, even if he has a hand as strong as pocket kings or pocket aces, it's not a spot where he can just call the turn thinking that I'm value raising with a worse hand, because my range is really polarized myself when I raise, and it's a spot where I expect to get a lot of credit. So he does go ahead and fold, but that's a play that I wouldn't have been able to make that play out of position, because I'd assume that if he was in position with a hand like 8-9 or pocket 9s or pocket 6s, if I was to check call the flop there, he would just check back on the turn. Whereas when it's blind versus blind, he kind of has to go ahead and bet those on the turn, because it comes very sort of sticky spot if he checks, because he knows I've got a wide range, but he doesn't know how I'm going to play that. So a lot of the times he's just going to bet for kind of protection / information / a little bit of value, and when I do go ahead and raise, he just has to fold those hands. So hopefully that's shown you a few good examples of how position can be utilized in practice, and I think that it shows you why you can play a lot more hands in position than you can when you're out of position. Obviously your ranges are going to depend who's playing at the table. Like if there's some really aggressive players behind you, you're going to want to be tight from under the gun and middle position. And if you're against a regular who you know plays really straightforwardly and turns his range face up in a lot of spots, then you can really call when you're like on the button or in the cutoff against like early position or middle position open with a much wider range of hands than you would against some other players. It's impossible to say exactly what those ranges are. It's going to be dependent on how comfortable you are playing post flop and how much you can utilize these plays in practice. But it's definitely something to consider, and it's something that you really want to pay attention to. You want to make sure that you're not playing too many hands when you're out of position and too few hands when you're in position. You really want to be thinking about position in all spots. So I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and I'm sure there's going to be a way to leave comments and discussion on the videos. So please get in touch and let me know if you have any questions regarding any of the concepts that I talked about here. I look forward to making part 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 for you. I hope that you learned something from this video, and I hope that you have good success at the tables because of it. So yeah, this has been Jack for iPoker. ipokervip.net. Thanks for watching and take care. Cheers.